My wife said she felt overwhelmed by commitment and needed distance to think clearly. I gave her space immediately, consulted my attorney, revised the ownership structure, and protected my business assets. She reached out months later when distance meant losing access to shared equity. "I just need you to stop being so present all the time." That's what she said. Not that she was unhappy. Not that something was broken between us. Not that she had found someone else, or that she wanted a divorce, or that there was some specific, fixable problem we could sit down and work through together. Just that I was too present. I was standing in our kitchen, holding a cup of coffee I hadn't even taken a sip from yet, and my wife of 6 years looked at me across the island like I was the problem. Like breathing the same air as her had become an inconvenience. I set the coffee down slowly. "Too present," I repeated. "Yes," she said, without flinching. "In our house. In my space," she corrected. And right there, in that single correction, I felt something shift. Not break. Not shatter. Shift. Like the ground beneath me had moved an inch to the left, and I was the only one who felt it. Her name was Nicole. We had been married for 6 years, together for 8. Hey viewers, before we move on to the video, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button if you want to see more stories like this. I was 39, she was 36, and we lived in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb outside of Denver that I had bought 2 years before we got married. I owned a mid-sized digital marketing agency that I had built from nothing, starting in my apartment with 2 laptops and a roster of 3 clients. By the time Nicole said those words to me that Tuesday morning, the agency had 21 employees, 12 active retainer contracts, and annual revenue just under $4 million. Nicole knew all of this. She had watched me build it. She had, at one point, told me it was one of the things she loved most about me, that I was a builder. But standing in that kitchen, it felt like she was looking at everything I had built and calculating something. And I just couldn't tell what. "I think I need some distance," she said, later that same evening. We were sitting across from each other at the dinner table. She had cooked, which she rarely did anymore, and I remember thinking that was strange. People cook when they want to soften something. Distance from what? I asked. "From the weight of all of this," she said, gesturing vaguely around the room. "The commitment. The structure. I feel like I can't think clearly when I'm this deep inside it." I looked at her for a long moment. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. She was calm in a way that bothered me more than either of those things would have. Calm like someone who had already made a decision and was now informing you of it, rather than discussing it with you. "How long?" I asked. "I don't know," she said. "That's the point. I need time without a deadline." "And where would you go?" "I'd stay at Brooke's place for a while." Brooke was her college roommate. They had stayed close over the years. I had never had a problem with Brooke, but something about the readiness of that answer, the fact that she already had a place lined up, told me this conversation had been rehearsed, possibly for weeks. "Okay," I said. She blinked. "That's it." "Okay. You said you need space," I said. "I'm not going to beg you to stay in a house where you feel trapped." I watched something flicker across her face. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to recalculation. "I'm not saying I want a divorce," she said quickly. "I know," I said. "I just need clarity." "I understand," I said, and I meant it. But I also meant something else. Something I didn't say out loud. Because the moment she told me she needed distance to think clearly, I started thinking clearly too. She left 3 days later. 2 suitcases, a duffel bag, and a box of things she said she'd need for the short term. She hugged me at the door. It was a long hug, actually. The kind that feels like an apology. I held on to her, and I breathed in the smell of her shampoo, and I thought about the 8 years we had spent building a life together. And I thought about how much of that life was tangled up in assets and structures and agreements that had never been questioned because we had never needed to question them. And then she pulled back, looked me in the eyes, and said, "I just need to hear myself think again." I nodded. She got in her car and pulled out of the driveway. I watched until I couldn't see the car anymore. Then I went inside, sat down at my desk, and called my attorney. His name was Victor. He had been my business attorney for 4 years. He also had a family law background, which I had never needed until that moment. I told him what had happened. I told him everything. The conversation, the calm, the rehearsed answer about Brooke's place, the vague language about commitment and weight and clarity. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Did she say the word divorce at any point?" "She specifically said she wasn't asking for a divorce." "Okay," he said. "But she's also not saying she's coming back." "No," I said. "She's not saying that." Then here's what I want you to understand, Victor said. The moment she walked out that door, the clock started ticking on several things simultaneously. He explained what those things were. He was thorough. He was methodical. And by the end of that call, I had a clear picture of exactly how exposed I was. Because here's the part of the story that matters. Nicole was not an employee of my agency. She had never worked there in any official capacity. But 3 years into our marriage, during a period when the business was growing quickly and I was restructuring to attract a potential investor, my previous attorney had suggested a reorganization of the company's ownership structure. For reasons that seemed logical at the time, tax efficiency, estate planning, and a kind of naive optimism that our marriage was permanent, Nicole had been added as a minority stakeholder in the holding company that controlled the agency. It was a 15% stake. At the time, the company was valued around $1.2 million. By the time she walked out of our house with 2 suitcases, the same stake was worth considerably more. Victor said it plainly. She may not be asking for a divorce right now, but if this separation extends, or if she eventually does file, that 15% becomes a very complicated conversation. I know, I said. And the house, he said. I know, I said again. You need to decide what you want to do, he said. I already know what I want to do, I told him. Tell me. So I did. The first thing I did was document everything. Not out of malice. Not out of anger. Out of clarity. The same clarity she said she was going to Brooks Place to find. I pulled every financial record from the last 6 years. Every joint account statement. Every business filing. Every tax return. Every document that touched the intersection of our marriage and my company. I also kept a written log of our communications from that point forward. Every text, every call, every voicemail. Not because I expected a fight, but because I had learned, from watching other people's lives fall apart, that the time to document is before you need the documents, not after. The second thing I did was retain Victor not just as my business attorney, but formally as my legal counsel for potential family proceedings. He helped me understand the full picture. The house was in my name. I had purchased it before the marriage. That was clean. But the holding company was more complicated because Nicole's stake had been gifted into the structure during the marriage, and certain commingling of funds had occurred over the years. Victor was honest with me. He said any restructuring we did now would be examined carefully if it ever ended up in front of a judge. Everything had to be done above board, documented with clear, legitimate business rationale. We're not hiding anything, he said. We're protecting the business, I said. That's right, he said. As long as every step is defensible, you're fine. So we made every step defensible. Over the next 3 weeks, I worked with Victor and a restructuring consultant to revise the ownership architecture of the holding company. The restructuring was grounded in a real operational need. We had been in conversation with a private equity group about a potential minority investment since early that year. The talks had stalled, partly because of complexity in the ownership structure. Specifically, the presence of a non-operating minority stakeholder with no operational role was flagged by their due diligence team as a liability. They weren't wrong. It had been flagged before, actually. I had just never prioritized fixing it. Now I had every reason to. The restructuring moved Nicole's passive minority stake into a separate trust vehicle, effectively isolating it from the operational entity. It was a legitimate reorganization, the kind any competent business attorney would recommend under the circumstances. Victor walked me through the documentation meticulously. It was clean. It was legal. It was exactly what should have been done years earlier. But it also meant that the 15% stake, while still technically hers in the trust structure, was now walled off from the day-to-day operations and value generation of the business in a way it hadn't been before. The PE group was pleased. They resumed serious conversations within 2 weeks of the restructuring. And I, for the first time in months, felt like I could breathe. Nicole texted me about 3 weeks after she left. How are you doing? 3 words. The casual kind. The kind you send when you want to check if someone is still there, without actually asking if they're still there. I stared at it for a while before I responded. Keeping busy, I said. How about you? Finding some clarity, she replied. Good, I said. I think I just needed to reset. Makes sense. There was a pause, and then she sent another message. I miss the house. Not me. The house. I noticed that. I didn't say anything about it. The house isn't going anywhere, I said. She sent a heart emoji. I set my phone down and went back to the term sheet I was reviewing. The weeks became a month. A month became 2. We talked occasionally. Like conversations. How are you conversations? She asked about the business once, in a way that was casual but specific. She asked if the PE deal was still moving forward. I told her it was progressing. She said that was great. Then she said something I filed away and kept thinking about. She said, "I always believed in what you were building." Past tense. Believed, not believe. I didn't correct her, but I heard it. During those 2 months, I also started therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I needed to process what was happening without leaking it into every other area of my life. My therapist was a quiet, methodical man named Dr. Owen who specialized in high-functioning professionals dealing with major life transitions. He had a way of asking questions that made you answer them before you realized you had. In our 3rd session, he asked me what I thought Nicole actually wanted. I said I wasn't sure. He asked me what I feared she wanted. That one took me longer. Eventually, I said, "I think she wants the option." "The option for what?" he asked. "The option to come back," I said. "On her terms. When it's convenient. Without having lost anything in the meantime." He didn't say anything. He just looked at me. "And you're not willing to offer that," he said. "I'm willing to work on a marriage," I said. "I'm not willing to hold everything in stasis indefinitely while someone decides whether or not they want to be married." Dr. Owen wrote something down. "That sounds like clarity," he said. "It does," I said. And it did. Month 3. Nicole called me on a Sunday afternoon. Not a text. An actual call. I let it ring twice before I picked up. "Hey," she said. "Hey. I've been thinking a lot," she said. About us. About what I've been doing. About whether I made the right call." "Okay," I said. "I think I needed this," she said. "But I also think I might have overcorrected." I waited. She continued. "I know," she said. "But we've lived there together for 6 years." "We have," I said. "And the business," she said. "I know I have a stake in the holding company." "You do," I said. "It's been restructured since you left, but yes, you have a stake in a trust vehicle that holds a passive interest." Another pause. Longer this time. "Restructured?" she said. "Yes." "When?" "About 3 weeks after you left," I said. "Why?" "Because there was a PE deal moving forward and the existing structure had been flagged by their due diligence team as a liability," I said. "The reorganization was necessary for the deal to proceed." "You restructured the ownership without telling me?" "Your stake still exists," I said. "It's in a trust." "The reorganization was a business decision with legitimate operational rationale, fully documented, fully legal. But you moved it without telling me." "I made a business decision about my company," I said, "which I am fully entitled to do." The silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one had weight. "I need to talk to someone," she said. "That's your right," I said, and we ended the call. She retained an attorney within the week. A woman named Cassandra, who had a reputation in Denver for aggressive representation in high-asset separations. I heard her name from Victor, who heard it from her first communication to his office. Victor was not surprised. "This is what the dinner was about," he said. "I know," I said. "She came back to take stock." "I know," I said again. "How do you feel about that?" I thought about the blue linen dress. I thought about the bottle of wine she brought. I thought about the way she had smiled when I told her the PE deal was close. "I feel like I made the right calls," I said. "You did," Victor said. All of them," he confirmed. What followed was several weeks of attorneys communicating on our behalf. Cassandra raised the usual points. The length of the marriage. The commingling of finances. The appreciated value of the business during the marital period. Nicole's role as a supportive spouse during the business's growth years. Victor responded to each point methodically. He documented the premarital purchase of the house. He demonstrated that the holding company restructuring had clear and documented business rationale, predating any formal separation proceedings. He provided the PE firm's due diligence correspondence, which specifically flagged the passive minority stake as an issue months before Nicole had left. He showed that every move had been made transparently, legally, and with legitimate purpose. Cassandra pushed back. Victor held firm. There were 2 mediation sessions. Nicole attended both. I attended both. In the first session, she looked at me across the table with an expression that I couldn't entirely read. It wasn't quite angry. It wasn't quite sad. It was something more complicated than either. Like someone who had played a hand and was watching it get beaten by a better one. At the second session, about a month later, she said something during a break that I think she meant to say privately, but said loud enough that I heard it. She was on the phone with Brooke. She said, "He just had everything figured out before I even got there." I walked past her and didn't let my expression change. But I heard it. And yes, that was true. The settlement was reached 4 months later. Nicole received a fair financial outcome. I'm not going to pretend she walked away with nothing, because that's not what happened, and that's not what I wanted. The marriage had been real. The life we built had been real. She was entitled to a fair accounting of the marital period, and she received one. What she did not receive was the outsized windfall she would have had access to if I had done nothing. If I had stayed still while she went to Brooke's apartment to think. If I had waited passively. If I had assumed good faith and let the situation drift. The PE deal closed 3 months after the settlement. It valued the company at a number that would have made Nicole's original 15% stake worth more than the entirety of what she received in the settlement. Victor raised an eyebrow at me when we got the final valuation number. Timing, he said. Timing, I agreed. I want to stop here for a moment, because I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking this is a story about a man who outsmarted his wife, who protected his money, who won. But that's not how I experience it when I sit with it quietly. When I'm honest, the story I'm telling is about a moment in a kitchen where a woman who had been my partner for 8 years looked at me and told me I was too present. And I had to decide what that meant. I could have begged. I could have asked her to stay. I could have agreed to be less present, whatever that meant. I could have given her the space she asked for and simply waited, hoping she would come back in the same spirit she left. I chose not to do that, not because I had stopped loving her, but because I had listened carefully to the way she spoke, the preparation in her answers, the readiness of the plan, the calm that didn't feel like sadness. It felt like strategy. And when someone you love looks at you with strategic calm, the only honest response is clarity. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. Dr. Owen and I talked about the settlement in one of our sessions after it was finalized. He asked me if I felt relieved. I said yes. He asked if I felt sad. I said also yes. He asked me which one was louder. I thought about it for a long time. Relief, I said finally. He nodded. But the sadness is real too, I said. Of course it is, he said. The relief and the sadness are both about the same thing. What's that? The end of the story you thought you were living, he said. That landed somewhere deep. Because that's what a marriage is, in a way. A story you agree to tell together. And the most disorienting thing about what happened isn't the legal complexity, or the restructuring, or the mediation sessions. It's the moment in the kitchen. Before all of that, when I was holding a cup of coffee, and my wife told me I was too present. And I looked at her face and realized that the story she thought she was living had quietly become a different one. One I hadn't been shown. There's a part of this I haven't told yet. The part one found out later. About 4 months into the separation, before the mediation session started, I had lunch with a mutual friend of ours named Derek. Derek was one of those people who occupied the strange zone of being friends with both people in a couple. He had known Nicole from college and had met me through her. We had always gotten along well. He called me and said he wanted to check in. I said sure. We met at a place we had been to a dozen times over the years, a bar with good burgers and too many TVs, and Derek was quieter than usual from the beginning. After about 20 minutes of small talk, he put his beer down and said, "There's something I think you should probably know." I told him to go ahead. He told me that during the summer, which was several months before Nicole had the kitchen conversation with me, she had been spending a significant amount of time with someone, a man named Callum. Callum was a landscape architect who had done some work for a house in Nicole's friend group. He was, according to Derek, someone Nicole had been close to in a way that he found difficult to characterize precisely. I don't know exactly what it was, Derek said, but it was more than it should have been. He said he had been uncertain about telling me. He said he wasn't sure it was his place, but that now that the separation was underway, it felt wrong to stay quiet. I sat with that information for a few minutes. I ate some of my burger. I asked Derek if it had been physical. He said he genuinely didn't know. He said he thought it might have been emotional before it was anything else, but that the line had blurred at some point. I thanked him for telling me. We finished lunch. We walked out to the parking lot and shook hands. And I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for about 15 minutes. I didn't confront Nicole about Callum. Not during the mediation. Not ever really. There was a moment during the second mediation session where I considered it. Where I thought about putting that name on the table and watching her face. But I decided against it. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. Not because it didn't matter. It did. But because introducing it would have shifted the conversation from a clean, fact-based legal proceeding into something murkier and more emotional. And I had already won the clean version. I didn't need the messy one. Victor actually raised the issue in a private conversation. He said the information could be relevant depending on how certain claims were framed. I told him to leave it out. He looked at me for a moment. "That's your call," he said. "I know," I said. And I kept it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is know something and choose not to use it. Not out of weakness. Out of the knowledge that you don't need it. Nicole reached out to me one more time, about 2 months after the settlement finalized. It was a long text. She said she wasn't reaching out for any legal reason. She said she just wanted to say that she was sorry for how things had unfolded. She said she had done a lot of therapy and that she understood now that she had been running from something, and that the way she had handled the marriage in those final months had not been fair. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She just wanted to say it. I read it twice. I thought about what to write back. I wrote, "I hear you. Thank you for saying that." She replied with a single line. "You handled everything with more grace than I deserved." I stared at that for a while. I wasn't sure grace was the word I would have used, but I appreciated the acknowledgement, and I left it there. The business closed the PE deal 4 months after the settlement. The investment gave us the runway to expand the team and pursue 2 enterprise contracts we'd been circling for years. By the end of that year, revenue had increased by 38%. I promoted 2 senior employees to director-level positions. I hired a new head of strategy who brought a client book that doubled our retainer base within 6 months. I started going to the gym again. I read more. I traveled once, alone, to a place I had always wanted to go and never gone because it was the kind of trip you always imagined taking with someone else. It was Portugal, actually. I went to the same city where Nicole and I had celebrated our 5th anniversary. I ate at different restaurants. I walked through different streets. I sat at a waterfront cafe on a warm evening and had a glass of wine by myself and watched the light go down over the water. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the life in front of me belonged entirely to me. Not in a sad way. In a quiet, solid, real way. People ask me, when I tell this story, whether I had known. Whether some part of me had always suspected that Nicole's decision to leave was about more than feeling overwhelmed. And my honest answer is, not consciously. Not in the way you know something and carry it around. But when she said those words in the kitchen, "I just need you to stop being so present all the time," I felt something shift. And the shift told me that the woman standing across from me was not the same woman who had walked down the aisle 6 years earlier. Not because people can't change. People change. People grow in different directions. That's real and it happens, and it doesn't always make anyone a villain. But there was something in the preparation of her departure. The already arranged place to stay. The practiced calm. The timing of it all. That told me this wasn't a person who had woken up that morning feeling overwhelmed. This was a person who had been planning an exit for some time and was using the language of emotional wellness to make it feel like discovery rather than strategy. And once I understood that, the path forward was clear. You cannot negotiate with a strategy by being emotional. You can only meet it with your own clarity. Victor called me about 8 months after the settlement, just to check in. He did that occasionally. He asked how the business was going. I told him. He made a noise of satisfaction. Then he said, "I've thought about your case a few times." "Yeah." I said. "Not the legal mechanics," he said. "The decisions." "What about them?" "A lot of people, when they're in the middle of something like that, they freeze," he said. "Or they get reactive. They make moves out of panic or out of anger." "I was angry," I said. "I know," he said. "But you didn't move from anger." I thought about that. "No," I said. "I moved from clarity." "That's rarer than you think," he said. We talked for a few more minutes. When we hung up, I sat for a while with that word. Clarity. She had used it to justify leaving. I had used it to decide what to do next. Same word. Completely different relationship to it. I've been with someone new for about 4 months now. Her name is Mia. She's a civil engineer. She's funny in a dry, unexpected way. She asks good questions. She's not afraid of silence. And on our 3rd date, she said something that made me genuinely laugh. We were at dinner, and she asked me what the last hard lesson I had learned was. I told her, briefly, that I had been through a difficult separation. She nodded. She didn't pry. She said, "Did you come out of it knowing yourself better?" I said yes. She said, "Then it wasn't a loss." I looked at her across the table. "That's a generous way to see it," I said. "It's the accurate way," she said. And she picked up her fork and went back to her meal. And I thought, this is what a person who is actually at peace with herself sounds like. There's a version of this story where the lesson is about protecting assets, about legal strategy, about outmaneuvering someone who tried to maneuver you. And I understand why people read it that way. But that's not the version I carry. The version I carry is simpler. It starts in a kitchen with a cup of coffee I never finished. It starts with a woman who I love telling me I was too present. And it ends with me learning that presence is not a flaw. That being invested in your own life, your own work, your own future, is not a thing that needs to be apologized for. And that when someone asks you for distance, the most powerful thing you can do is give it to them fully. Not with resentment, not with begging, with complete, unhesitating, quietly dignified clarity. Because the people who love you for who you actually are will never ask you to become less of yourself in order to make them comfortable. And the people who do ask that, no matter how long you've known them, no matter how deeply you've loved them, no matter how warm they looked in that blue linen dress, are not asking you to give them space. They're asking you to hold still while they decide whether or not you're worth staying for. And the right answer to that question is not to hold still. The right answer is to keep moving forward, clearly, on your own terms, without looking back long enough to lose your footing. That's the story. That's all of it.